In 1324, one man gave away so much gold that he accidentally crashed an entire country's economy. He wasn't trying to, he was just being generous. The currency he broke didn't fully recover for a decade. And here's the strange part. Most people today have never even heard his name. He ruled the richest empire on earth, sat on top of the world's largest gold supply, and built a city that became one of the greatest centers of learning anywhere. Then it all vanished. So how does a kingdom that owned half the planet's gold get completely forgotten? And what happens when the wealth runs out? To understand that, we have to start with a road trip. One that took a year, involved 60,000 people, and changed history by accident. Somewhere around the year 1280, in the floodplains of the Niger River in West Africa, a boy was born into the royal family of Mali. His name was Musa. At that point, Mali was already a serious kingdom. Big territory, healthy trade, plenty of soldiers. But it wasn't the giant it was about to become. The Mali Empire sat right on top of two huge gold deposits called Bambuk and Bure, vast underground rivers of the stuff. While Europe was scraping together a few coins, West African miners were pulling gold out of the ground by the ton. Mali also controlled the trade routes that ran across the Sahara. Every caravan heading north to the Mediterranean had to pay tribute. Every load of salt coming south had to pay tribute. The money piled up. Musa came to power around 1312. The story of how is genuinely bizarre. The previous emperor, Abu Bakr II, supposedly became obsessed with finding out what lay across the Atlantic Ocean. He built a fleet of 2,000 ships and sailed west. Nobody ever saw him again. Mali needed a new ruler. Musa, who'd been left in charge of the empire while the old emperor went exploring, simply kept the throne. The cousin's gone. He's been gone for years. He could come back tomorrow. Are you going to wait? I don't think he's coming back. Then sit on the throne. It's already warm. Just like that, Musa became Mansa, the Mali word for emperor. And he was about to do something that would put his face on every map in the medieval world. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, and Islam requires every believer who can afford it to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their life. Most people walked there with a small bag and prayed they'd survive the trip. Musa decided to do it differently. He decided to bring the empire with him. In 1324, he set out from his capital with a caravan that nobody who saw it would ever forget. 60,000 people, 12,000 personal servants, each one carrying 4 pounds of solid gold. 80 camels behind them, each loaded with 300 pounds more. Heralds in Persian silk riding ahead on horses, clearing the road. Musa himself rode under a canopy held up by attendants. The whole thing stretched for miles. In a tent on the edge of the caravan, a young scribe named Yusuf, who friends sometimes called Joseph because of an old family story about a Christian merchant from the north, sat down with a fresh sheet of parchment. His job was to keep track of the gold. Every ingot, every pouch, every gift handed out along the route. He'd been doing this for 2 weeks, and the math had started to embarrass even the royal treasurer. How much have we given away so far? Don't ask. Yusuf, I need to know. 20,000 mythical. 20,000, that's just this week. Last week was 30. We have more. I know we have more. The Mansa wants to know if you need a bigger ledger. Tell the Mansa I need a bigger arm. The caravan moved at the pace of camels, which meant slowly. Across the Sahara, they passed oasis after oasis, and at every stop Musa gave gifts. Not coins, not jewelry, solid gold. To village elders, to traveling scholars, to anyone who recited a verse he liked. A poor herder who pointed them toward water received enough gold to buy his own herd 10 times over. Word started racing ahead of the caravan faster than the camels could walk. Something incredible was coming. Some emperor from a kingdom nobody in Egypt or Arabia had ever paid much attention to was throwing gold around like sand. By the time the caravan reached the outskirts of Cairo, every market in the city had already heard. And the Egyptian sultan, ruling one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, suddenly had a very awkward diplomatic problem on his hands. Cairo in 1324 was one of the great cities of the world. 500,000 people. Markets that sold spices from India and silk from China. a sultan named Al-Nasir Muhammad who ruled the Mamluk Empire, the same Mamluks who'd stopped the Mongols 60 years earlier. This was not a small power, and when Mansa Musa's caravan rolled up to the gates, the sultan immediately ran into a problem. Custom required Musa to come to the palace and kiss the ground before the sultan. It was the standard humiliation for visiting rulers, a reminder of who was really in charge. But Musa refused. He was an emperor too, and he wasn't bowing to anyone except God. There was a tense standoff for days. Finally, Musa agreed to a compromise. He'd visit the palace, but he'd kneel only as a prayer to God, not to the sultan. Al-Nasir accepted. The visit went ahead. Then Musa started shopping and tipping and donating. The sultan gave him a palace to stay in. Musa gave the sultan's officials gold. He gave gold to the imams at the mosques. He gave gold to the poor in the streets. He bought up Cairo's markets, paying double or triple whatever the merchants asked because he didn't want to seem cheap. The merchants, watching this man hand over gold like it was water, tripled their prices again. Musa paid those too. For 3 months the caravan lived in Cairo, and for 3 months gold poured into the Egyptian economy in quantities the city had never seen. Mansa, the markets are charging us 4 times the normal price. Pay it, they're laughing at us, let them laugh. They'll have something to remember us by. We've already given away more than the treasury planned for the whole pilgrimage. We have more, we always have more. Yusuf, write this down. Generosity that costs nothing is not generosity. The scribe wrote it down. Then he wrote down another shipment of gold leaving the storehouse. He'd stopped trying to keep an accurate count. The numbers had gotten silly. What Musa didn't understand, what nobody in 1324 fully understood, was how an economy works. When you flood a market with one commodity, the value of that commodity collapses. Gold had been the steady, reliable backbone of Egyptian currency for centuries, and Musa was about to break it without meaning to. The crash didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, the way real economic disasters always do. First, the price of bread in Cairo went up. Then the price of cloth. Then the price of everything. Merchants who'd been paid in Mansa Musa's gold tried to spend it, and discovered that every other merchant in the city had also been paid in Mansa Musa's gold. There was suddenly too much of it, and when there's too much of something, it stops being worth as much. Egyptian dinars, which had held steady against the dirham for generations, started sliding. Within a year, the gold dinar had lost something like a quarter of its value. Some accounts put it higher. A decade later, the currency still hadn't fully recovered. One man on a pilgrimage had managed to do what no invading army had ever done. He'd broken the Egyptian economy by being too nice. Modern archaeologists can actually trace this in the historical record. Egyptian price records from the 1320s show a sudden, sharp inflation that doesn't match any war or famine or harvest failure. The only event that lines up is Musa's visit. A single man's generosity left a fingerprint on the regional economy that scientists could still read 700 years later. Mansa, the chronicler from the Sultan's court, is here. He wants to ask about the gold. Tell him what he wants to know. He says the markets are unstable. People are complaining. People always complain. He says some merchants have gone bankrupt because gold is worth less now. I didn't know that could happen. Apparently it can. Yusuf, write that down too. Even kindness can have a price. Musa finished his stay in Cairo, paid his respects, and headed east toward Mecca. The pilgrimage itself was the spiritual core of the journey, and Musa performed every ritual with care. He prayed at the Kaaba, walked the 7 circuits, drank from the Zamzam well. He gave gold to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina too, though by now the supply was starting to run lower than expected. On the way home, the caravan actually had to borrow money in Cairo from the same merchants Musa had enriched on the way in. They charged him outrageous interest. He paid it anyway. The legend of the African emperor who gave away mountains of gold was now permanently lodged in every market from Morocco to Baghdad. When Mansa Musa finally got home to Mali in 1325, something unexpected was waiting for him. He was famous. Not in the polite, regional way that emperors normally got famous. Globally famous. Word of the pilgrimage had traveled along the trade routes faster than any caravan. Merchants in Venice were talking about him. Scholars in Damascus were writing about him. A Spanish mapmaker named Abraham Cresques, working a few decades later, drew Musa onto a famous chart called the Catalan Atlas. There he sits in the middle of Africa, crowned, holding a giant gold nugget the size of his fist, with a caption nomming him the richest king on earth. For the first time in history, a West African ruler appeared on a European map, and not as a footnote, as the main attraction. Back at home, Musa had bigger plans than just being remembered. He'd seen the great mosques of Cairo. He'd seen the universities of the Islamic world. And he decided that Mali, with all its wealth, deserved the same. He brought back architects, scholars, and engineers from his journey. An Andalusian poet and architect named E. Saheli traveled with him to Mali and started designing buildings. Mosques rose in the desert towns. Madrasas, which were Islamic schools, opened their doors. And one city in particular started growing into something the world had never seen on this side of the Sahara: Timbuktu. Timbuktu sat on the southern edge of the desert, right where the Sahara met the Niger River. It had been a trading post for centuries. Salt came south. Gold and slaves and ivory went north. Under Musa's patronage, it became something else: a university city. The Sankor Madrasa, the Djingueber Mosque, the Sidi Yahya Mosque, three great centers of learning, were either built or massively expanded during this period. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to teach there. Students came to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. Manuscripts were copied by hand and traded for more than their weight in gold. In one of those libraries, in a courtyard shaded by a single thorn tree, a scholar's daughter named Amina, who family stories sometimes called Emily after a Coptic Christian ancestor who'd come south with a trader, was studying a chart of the night sky. She was 14 years old. Her father was a teacher of astronomy at the Sankor Madrasa, and she was about to argue with him about the moon. "Amina, the calculation is wrong. The calculation is what the book says." "Then the book is wrong. You're 14. The book was written by a scholar in Baghdad 200 years ago. He was a great man. He also didn't have my measurements." Amina's father set down the chart he was holding and looked at his daughter for a long moment. He'd been teaching at Sankor for 15 years. He'd argued with grown men who traveled from Fez and Damascus to study under him. None of them had ever pointed out that his favorite book on lunar cycles was off by a fraction. His daughter had spotted it in an afternoon. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He spent the rest of the night recalculating, and by morning he agreed with her. This was not unusual in Timbuktu. The city had something like 25,000 students at its peak, in a population of maybe 100,000. That's a higher ratio than most European universities of the time. Women studied there too, though the records are uneven. The libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts on every subject the Islamic world cared about: medicine, optics, music theory, agriculture, jurisprudence, geography, poetry. A Timbuktu manuscript from this era might cite scholars from Andalusia, Cairo, and Persia in a single paragraph. The city was wired into the global intellectual network in a way that Europe, in its medieval slumber, wasn't. And underneath it all, the gold kept flowing. Musa died around 1337. His son Magan took over. Then came other rulers. The empire stayed strong for a while, but cracks started showing. The problem with an empire built on one emperor's personal brilliance is that the next emperor usually isn't as brilliant. Border provinces started pulling away. Trade routes got harder to control. The Tuareg, the nomadic people of the Sahara, captured Timbuktu temporarily in 1433. Mali got it back, but the message was clear. The giant was wobbling. By the late 1400s, a new empire was rising in the same region. The Songhai, who'd been a vassal state of Mali for generations, broke away under a leader named Sunni Ali. He was brutal, brilliant, and patient. He captured Timbuktu in 1468 and treated the scholars there harshly, suspecting them of plotting against him. Many fled, but the city survived, and under Sunni Ali's successor, a man named Askia Muhammad, it actually flourished again. Askia Muhammad took the throne of Songhai in 1493 by overthrowing Sunni Ali's son. He was a devout Muslim, a sharp administrator, and a man who understood that conquering Timbuktu was easier than ruling it well. He invited the scholars back. He funded the libraries. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He made his own pilgrimage to Mecca in 1497, though he was smart enough to not break any currencies on the way. Under Askia, Songhai became even bigger than Mali had been at its peak. It stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into what's now Niger and Nigeria. The gold mines still produced. The salt caravans still crossed the Sahara. The scholars in Timbuktu kept writing manuscripts. For a century, the Songhai Empire was the dominant power in West Africa, and the wider world mostly didn't notice. But the wider world was changing. In Europe, the Portuguese had started sailing down the African coast, looking for a way to bypass the Saharan gold trade entirely. By the late 1400s, they'd reached the West African coast and started buying gold directly from coastal kingdoms. This was a slow disaster for empires like Songhai, who'd built their wealth on controlling the desert routes. If gold could be loaded onto a ship in West Africa and sailed directly to Lisbon, who needed Timbuktu? The trans-Saharan trade started declining, not all at once but steadily. And up in Morocco, a sultan named Ahmed al-Mansur was watching the slow weakening of his southern neighbor with growing interest. Ahmed al-Mansur ruled the Saudi dynasty in Morocco. He just won a famous battle against the Portuguese in 1578 and was sitting on a pile of ransom gold from captured nobles. But he wanted more. The gold mines of West Africa were the dream. Other rulers had imagined invading across the Sahara before. None had ever actually done it. The desert was the defense. A march of 2,000 miles across the most hostile terrain on Earth, where armies dehydrated to death in days. Ahmed al-Mansur looked at the map and decided he had an advantage nobody else had ever had. Cannons. Gunpowder weapons that nobody in West Africa had ever faced. In 1591, he sent an army of about 4,000 men south across the Sahara. Half of them died on the way. The other half were enough. The Songhai army that met them on the battlefield at Tondabai numbered something like 40,000 soldiers, including a famous cavalry. They outnumbered the Moroccans 10-1. They lost in a few hours. Cannons and muskets against cavalry and spears. The Songhai had never seen this kind of weapon before, and once the noise started, their cattle, which they'd herded in front of the lines as a kind of mobile shield, panicked and stampeded back into their own ranks. The line broke. The empire that had ruled West Africa for a century was gone in a single afternoon. Sultan, the Songhai army is destroyed. We took the capital. We took Gao. Then take Timbuktu, already done. And the gold, that's the strange part. There isn't as much as you said there would be. What do you mean? We've searched the palaces. We've taxed the merchants. There's gold, but not the rivers of it the legends promised. Search harder. They searched harder. There still wasn't as much as the legends had promised. Part of the problem was that the gold mines themselves were further south, in territories that weren't fully under anyone's central control anymore. Part of the problem was that a century of trans-Saharan trade decline had already drained the storehouses. And part of the problem was that nobody had ever actually known how much gold Mali and Songhai had. The reputation, the Mansa Musa legend, had been doing a lot of the work. The Moroccans hung around for a while, governing badly from a distance, dragging scholars and treasure back across the desert. One famous scholar, Ahmed Baba, was forced into exile in Morocco. He spent years writing about his homeland from captivity. Eventually, the Moroccan grip loosened. Local rulers reasserted themselves, but the great age of West African empires was finished. Nobody would ever again rule the gold trade the way Musa had. Timbuktu survived, smaller and quieter. The scholars kept working. The libraries kept growing slowly, manuscript by manuscript. Across the centuries that followed, while Europe got rich on Atlantic trade and West African gold flowed out by ship instead of by camel, Timbuktu became something it had never wanted to be, a symbol of a vanished age. By the time European explorers finally reached it in the 1800s, expecting to find a city paved with gold, they were stunned. It was a town of mud brick buildings in the desert. They wrote home, disappointed. they'd missed the point entirely. The point was in the libraries. Behind those mud brick walls, in family trunks and storerooms, sat manuscripts that had been quietly accumulating for 600 years. By the 21st century, scholars estimated that Timbuktu and its surrounding towns held something like 700,000 surviving manuscripts, some in great institutional libraries, most in private family collections, passed down for generations. Books on astronomy, on medicine, on poetry, on diplomacy, on the proper way to handle a legal dispute over a stolen camel. They were a record of a civilization that the outside world had almost completely forgotten existed. And in 2012, somebody decided to burn them. A coalition of jihadist groups, including Ansar Dine and an offshoot of al-Qaeda, swept into northern Mali in early 2012, taking advantage of a coup in the south. They captured Timbuktu in April. They imposed a brutal version of religious law. They started destroying things they considered un-Islamic: Sufi shrines, saints' tombs, and then they turned on the libraries. The manuscripts, with their poetry and astronomy and centuries of human curiosity, were declared idolatrous. The Ahmed Baba Institute, which held about 40,000 manuscripts in a beautiful new building funded by South Africa, was a particular target. The librarians of Timbuktu had been expecting something like this for months. They'd already started moving. A man named Abdul Qadir Haidara, who'd spent his life collecting and preserving manuscripts, and who was descended from a long line of Timbuktu scholars, organized a secret operation. They built metal footlockers, hundreds of them. They packed manuscripts into the lockers under cover of night. They loaded the lockers onto donkeys and motorbikes and small trucks. They smuggled them south, manuscript by manuscript, family by family, through jihadist checkpoints across the Niger River, all the way to Bamako, the capital of Mali, hundreds of miles away. Abdul Qadir, the road south is blocked. Then we use the river. The river is patrolled. Then we use donkeys at night. We'll lose some. We'll lose more if we leave them here. By the time French troops drove the jihadists out of Timbuktu in early 2013, the libraries were nearly empty. About 4,000 manuscripts were burned in the chaos. The rest, hundreds of thousands of them, were safe in basements and back rooms in Bamako, waiting out the war. The descendants of Musa's scholars had saved the empire's memory with metal boxes and motorbikes. In a small apartment in Bamako, a teenage girl named Awa, who friends in her coding club sometimes called Sophia after a French teacher she'd liked, was studying engineering on her phone. It was 2024. The phone was built with coltan, a metal mined a few thousand miles east in Central Africa, refined and assembled across half a dozen countries, and sold back to her in a country whose ancestors had once supplied the world with gold. Mali in the 2020s was landlocked, under international sanctions following another coup, struggling with the same jihadist insurgency that had tried to burn Timbuktu's libraries a decade earlier. The gold mines still produced. Most of the profit left the country. Awa had never been to Timbuktu. Her grandmother had once as a child before the Troubles. She'd grown up hearing the stories. The emperor who'd given away so much gold he broke Egypt's economy. The scholars who'd studied the stars in a city of mud brick. The librarians who'd saved hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on the back of motorbikes. She'd seen the famous portrait of Mansa Musa from the Catalan Atlas in a school textbook. The richest man in human history by some inflation-adjusted estimates. A man from her country, from her people. It was hard to fit that into the present she was living in. But she was studying engineering anyway. She wanted to build solar grids for villages that didn't have power. She wanted to learn enough to come back and do something. The history was heavy, but it wasn't only heavy. It was also a reminder that this place had been the center of the world once. It could be something again. The Mali Empire's collapse wasn't really one event. It was a long unwinding across centuries of gold and trade routes and ships that bypassed the desert. But what the empire left behind wasn't only ruins. It was the manuscripts in the metal boxes. It was the name Timbuktu, which still means something in every language. It was the proof that an African empire had once been the richest place on earth, and that the people who lived there had spent that wealth on universities and books. The gold is gone. The memory isn't. If you enjoyed this story, you'll probably love the one about the Aztec gold that vanished overnight and was never found. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.